Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the 16th Lynford Lecture by Dr. Eric Schadt. Over time, this lecture has acquired strong reputation within this school and even NYU as a whole. So more about this will be said later on, so I will not repeat it. Let me say a few words about the lecturer. Dr. Schadt is an expert on computational biology in a broad sense, with a focus on network organized wisdom of crowds. But basic idea is that it is different from the molecular point of view, which is reductionist, and it will be more system type. He is the director of the Institute for Genomics and Multiscale Biology, chair of the Department of Genetics and Genomics Sciences, and the Gene C. and James W. Crystal Professor of Genomics at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. Dr. Schadt, welcome to Polytechnic School, NYU Polytechnic School of Engineering. Likewise, I want to welcome to the distinguished panel, two panelists. One, our own Professor Beth Novak, who is now being mic'd up, the founder director of GovLab, and also Dr. Ellen Schadt, the Jill Roberts Professor of Clinical Medicine at Weill Cornell Medical College. Welcome to both of you. Special lectures like this always have a special connotation within the institution, and I should say a few words about why, in what context this lecture is special to us. The reason is the active involvement of Jeff and Tondra Lynford. They're sitting right there along with their nephew. The Lynfords are very well known to all of us, but still it's a good idea for me to say a few words about them without embarrassing them. Jeff is the vice chair of the Poly board and also a member of the NYU Board of Trustees, but it's only a small part of the number of network of boards on which he serves. And the best way to describe Jeff is that even where his own self-interests are involved, and there are many things in which he's involved, he never forgets his desire to serve society. I think this is what I really think of you, Jeff. It's a trait I appreciate a lot. Among other things, he's the president and CEO of Educational Housing Society and the Commissioner of Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. In particular, of course, you will hear from Jeff directly in a short while. Even with all the dynamism that Jeff commands, he would not be as effective without Tondra Lynford. She is one of the most humble people I know, and very interesting people to talk to. Tondra not only is part of the Lynford Charitable Trust, but she co-founded her own trust on resources for children with special needs and serves on the Anderson Foundation for Autism. Tondra, welcome. So my special welcome also goes to Provost David McLaughlin, who comes to these lectures very regularly as far as I know, and he always has a soft corner for Poly, which I appreciate. So there is another reason why these lectures are special to us, and it is the involvement of these two gentlemen at this end of the audience, our distinguished professors, David Chudnovsky and Gregory Chudnovsky. Their association with the Lynford Lecture is long-standing and quite valuable. David and Gregory, thank you for your participation and welcome to this event. I'm sure it is not lost on you that tomorrow is the Pi Day. But for those others who don't know what Pi Day is, tomorrow is March 14th of the year 2015. So 3/14/15. You have to put a decimal place at the right place, a decimal point at the right place. So I think it is sort of momentous for us for some reason like that. So with this, I will close my welcome remarks. But I want to thank all my colleagues in my office, by which I mean all of the School of Engineering, who have worked very hard on this event. And without their help and participation, there would be no substance. So thank you very much. Now I think the floor is yours, Jeff, and Jeff will actually carry it off with the usual aplomb, I'm sure. So thank you so much.
Fellow trustees, Provost McLaughlin, President Srinivasan, Professors Chudnovsky, faculty, students, and honored guests, and that includes my sister-in-law and my nephew, Mark. Mark, this is your second attending lecture, and he's a sophomore from John Jay High School in Katona, New York, and I hope you'll be an NYU student someday. I'm in there lobbying, and anybody who wants to lobby with me today and see Mark, I appreciate that. Since 1998, IMAS, the Institute for Mathematics and Advanced Supercomputing, founded by the brothers Chudnovsky, Tondra and I have convened this symposium annually to invite a leading scientist, thinker, engineer to explain his or her latest research on various topics from string theory to cyber defense to behavior in the financial markets to genomics. And I was telling Dr. Schadt earlier that it's very appropriate that he be here because in 1999 we had Craig Ventner, who said in 1999 that he hoped by 2001 to decode the genome, which he did 2 years later. And so hopefully 2 years from now and 15 years from now we can brag that you were here and your most exciting achievements are yet to come. Over the past 15 lectures, we've had 3 Nobel laureates, 2 Turing Award winners, and 1 Fields medalist. So we've had a great array of thinkers, usually in advance of what their research has ultimately proven. As you know, today we are pleased to have Dr. Schadt, and what I think I'm going to do, because of his, one word that describes him among many is iconoclast. And when he comes up here, you will see in this weather he is wearing shorts. And therefore, in solidarity, I am going to take off my tie, okay? And maybe my jacket. I'll stop there for propriety. But I want to say that your influence has generated more than just genomic work. There's only one thing. I also then took off my microphone, but we'll fix that later. So Dr. Schadt is a graduate of Polytechnic in California, California Polytechnic University, and then UC Davis, and then UCLA. In 2011, he founded the Icahn Genomics and Multiscale Biology program and school at Mount Sinai Hospital. His professional work now combines mathematics and computational biology, and he is at the forefront of new ways to unlock the complexities of human health and biology. And this afternoon we are joined by 2 distinguished interlocutors, Professor Beth Simone Novik from NYU and Dr. Ellen J. Sherrill from Weill Cornell Medical College. And after Dr. I'm going to call you Eric, if I may. And after Eric speaks, we will then repair to this setup here on your right and have a panel discussion, and I will introduce our 2 interlocutors more at that time. So what is multi-scale biology, and how does this relate to you students in the audience? Anybody know? Raise your hand. I'll call on you. You're not I know you're a student, but I want a real student, aspiring administrator. Well, in 2 simple words, big data. So we have iconoclast and we have big data. And so if you go home today, Mark, without any other 2 words, those are words to take home with you. Okay. And so at NYU, our students and faculty, including David and Gregory, work to conceive the algorithms to develop the electrical engineering techniques and technologies that, in effect, uncover the large hidden values from massive, diverse, and complex data sets that big data is all about. And so Dr. Eric collects massive quantities of data and figures out how they are relevant to disease and medicine. And in 2014, his institute announced the Resilience Project. This is very controversial. Iconoclast. This project is to genotype up to 1 million people with a goal of identifying the rare biological mechanisms that keep people healthy when they have genetic variants that should cause disease. It will scan the genomes of healthy people, age 30 and older, who contribute their DNA, with an initial focus on 127 diseases. And before I invite the doctor up, I want to give you a couple words about balance, caution, and the two words are inductive reasoning and privacy, because big data has an implication for both. And who's heard of Sherlock Holmes? Someone has to have heard of Sherlock Holmes, okay. And he has to do with reasoning, both inductive and deductive. Inductive is where you go from the general to the specific. And I might be simplifying it, but he is wondering, do we need the inductive as we search for answers for disease? Can we replace it by the accumulation of massive data, analyze it, and come up with solutions without having the question in advance? That leads to a lot of interesting questions that Dr. Sherrill will put him on the spot about half an hour, okay? Because she uses the reverse. She pinpoints the disease and asks questions about it. And then there's the privacy issue. If you're collecting information over 1 million people, what information are you collecting? Who sees it? How is it used? And Dr. or Professor Nowick will ask about that because her experience in the White House and now here is about information and privacy, among so many other things. And so now, let's welcome Dr. Schadt to the podium. Thank you. I hope I
Yeah, so thank you so much for the invitation for the Lynfords, and David and Greg for really advocating their soulmates of sorts, given that math background and solving really fundamental problems. We had a really great discussion. And I've been here 3 years, and my aim is not to give up the Palo Alto vibe. So I moved here from Palo Alto, and I'm committed to bringing some of that to New York City. And now I'm sitting in the midst of a pretty big medical center, and what I learned about medicine that was a little shocking to me when I first got to Mount Sinai was the system, set up to basically take people who can pay and to run as many tests on them as possible to generate revenue. That's the model, right? So if you're not sick enough to require some type of care, you're not paid as much attention to, but if you need lots of care, we're going to find it. And of course, what's happened is that model is being turned upside down on its head from the Affordable Care Act and other sorts of changes to one of needing to actually prevent the disease, right? That's something that I think we should all aspire to. Instead of waiting for people to get catastrophically ill and come in and cost lots of money, which the hospitals like because they make that money, that's how they generate the revenue, we actually want to reach out and try to prevent those diseases, prevent people from actually needing to come into the hospital. And so what locked into my head pretty early on was this idea of orthodoxy, how conservative and how adherent to orthodoxies these big medical centers are. And here, just if you've forgotten about what an orthodoxy is, these are really the long-held core beliefs that are no longer true or applicable, but they're adhered to anyway, just from the sheer inertia of having adhered to them for such a long time. And they can really stifle innovation, right? They can stifle, make you put on the blinders and see things in a really limited way. And this is not exclusive to medicine, right? We've seen this throughout human history, and some of my favorites are this is not coming through very well, but Mr. Warner in 1927 proclaiming, who's ever going to want to hear an actor talk in a movie, right? And Mr. Watson at IBM talking about maybe a world market for 5 computers, right? So those are the orthodoxies that the experts kind of get tunneled into, and again, they can stifle activity and innovation. So we see that in medicine, but one thing that's helping us really disrupt the status quo in medicine is coming from the outside, and it's this big wave of technology really across a really broad spectrum, you know, from the entire Internet of Things to advanced materials, 3D printing, of course, next generation genomics and big data analytics, the cloud, and so on. A lot of amazing technologies that are enabling us both to generate very large sets of data, but then to also manage and compute and learn from those data, and then to share that information and to benefit from it. And so that's sort of to lots of things, but in the medical arena, it's giving rise to this digital health revolution. And I see the digital health revolution as really 3 interwoven components. We have sort of the mobile health component, which is really about the analytics to leverage all of the data from easily accessible devices like mobile devices. There's this whole idea of quantified self, right? Our ability to now monitor ourselves with lots of sensors, both molecularly. We can get sequenced, and you can have your gut microbiome checked, you can wear Fitbits, you can have, you know, the next wave of sensors coming that'll, you know, measure 10 physiological parameters on yourself, from, you know, heart rate to blood pressure to temperature to bioimpedance to pulse oximetry and so on. So, you know, and you're acquiring that data longitudinally, all right? So it's not the single snapshot that you get in the doctor's office. You know, you're there, most of you probably at the doctor's office, maybe 10 minutes talking to a physician a year, right? What kind of profile can they really generate on you? Well, now with this quantified self-enablement from technology, you can generate a pretty accurate profile. And of course, the almighty health IT. How are we going to, you know, the ability to manage, aggregate, manage, and compute on really big data. And these 3 interwoven components have given rise to just an amazing explosion of companies, again, across a wide spectrum of areas. You know, from healthcare to data sharing and analytics to wellness. And this is just a really small sampling of the literally hundreds to thousands of companies that are now all oriented around how to, you know, basically provide better profiles, enable people to better assess their wellness, their health condition, and how to share information and so on. Astonishing that there are now, a new study out by Oliver Wyman, 50,000 to 100,000 mobile health apps or internet-related apps now in existence. Just an astonishing number that we started thinking a lot about how do we want to engage patient populations and more general consumers. Is this a game we want to get into given just the sheer numbers? So we started looking at a lot of the types of apps that were out there and started seeing pretty common themes, you know, from apps that are sort of context to location aware, the whole socially powered component of the apps, intuitive and easy to use, the predictive analytics around the information collected and aggregated across populations, a pretty important component, and so on. So we thought a lot about what our place in this could be, and our main motivation was we have to transform how medicine is practiced, right, away from waiting till you're catastrophically ill to come into the hospital to one of reaching out to you far earlier to better assess your risk, your health trajectory, and how we can help you stay on a healthy trajectory as well as along with preventing you from sliding into disease. And so it really gets at this healthcare system of the future, which is going to be much more about how to drive care and again, monitoring of health into the home, right? So you're no longer coming into the physician's office to be assessed. A lot of that is happening into the home, and what you should or shouldn't be doing is sort of managed from the comfort of your home, again, using all of the advanced technologies. And my view is in 5 to 10 years' time, there's going to be far more information on your health existing outside of the medical center than within the medical center. So you're going to have a much better health profile, baseline of who you are and what makes you tick and how you compare or don't compare to others, and how deviations from that baseline can put you at risk for certain diseases. So based on this, we started looking at a bunch of different, how we could differentiate ourselves in this space of driving care to the consumer into their homes. And we saw a few areas where we could make true advances on collecting information on individuals to help better profile, assess their risk and their wellness. One of them is around education and consent. So how do we get people to engage in wanting to be involved in their own health? How do we get them to contribute information? How do we get to generate, say, DNA sequencing on somebody and get them to understand what it means to contribute that information? So the whole idea of consenting and educating is, in my estimation, very key if we're going to have this revolution of enabling people to better understand their health and be an active participant in it. So we've created, in collaboration with Sage Bionetworks and Apple, this was announced at Apple's big event on Monday, the idea of electronic consenting. Again, the whole idea is how can we expand to very large populations, aggregate more information to build more accurate models of disease, which I'll get into in a few minutes. And the electronic consenting is key. And just to give you an example of that, we announced with Apple, with Tim Cook on Monday, an asthma app that was intended to recruit individuals into an asthma study where we employed electronic consenting, and in 6 hours we had enrolled 2,500 to 3,000 people in the research study. If you were to carry that same study out in a more traditional, classic way, it would take you 3 to 5 years to accomplish that kind of recruitment. But we were able to get that in just a few hours using the electronic consenting. The other one relates to testing, doing deeper profiles on somebody, say sequencing your genome or your microbiome, and then conveying that information back to you in a way that can impact your decision making about what you might do regarding your health. And that's an area that, again, is highly controversial, and the state of New York regulates what we can say to a pretty deep level on this. So we've begun work to incorporate into these apps an electronic genetic counseling platform, because again, we can't depend on humans to one-on-one communicate information to consumers or patients on this level, because it's just not a scalable model, right? There's not enough genetic counselors in existence to play that game. So why should you be access to that type of service just because there are not enough people trained? And so we're aiming to solve that by doing it electronically. So I think of it as like LegalZoom.com, right? You don't need a lawyer for every single legal thing you do, right? For a lot of these things, you can be guided through some steps, fill out a form, fill out your will, whatever. If you need a lawyer, the lawyer is there, but for maybe 90% of the things you do, you don't need it, and you can be guided through. The other place we're differentiating in these apps compared to the 50,000 that are out there is we actually want to run clinical trials where these are demonstrated to have clinical utility, right? They actually have a benefit, or they can enhance our ability to reduce disease-related distress, to assess better symptom control, improve quality of life, and fewer unexpected medical visits. Those are the types of outcomes that we want to achieve, both through better aggregation of data, better analytics, and better advice to the people using the apps, and whether it can improve their health outcomes. Another differentiator, this is to the crowd to the left, is really around the analytics and the supercomputing needed to manage the big kinds of data that we're aiming to generate and aggregate on individuals. And so, I think this is something that's largely underappreciated, even though you hear a lot of the words about big data, underappreciated in the big medical centers, and who's going to be the most competitive in generating accurate risk profiles on an individual and how to best counsel them about their health. You're going to need to be able to play this kind of game, and we've picked up guys like Jeff Hammerbacher, right, who's the founding chief data scientist of Facebook, then founded Cloudera, right, which is how do we bring Hadoop-style computing to the masses, and now at Mount Sinai helping us play this, big data game on web-scale architectures that will enable us, whether we have 500 patients or 1 billion patients, right, we'll have a flexible architecture that enables us to scale and collect data, manage data, and compute on it. So given that sort of thing, I already said a little bit about our collaboration with Apple, National Jewish, so they're an affiliate of Mount Sinai now around the pulmonary area, and our first wave of apps was around how do we better manage chronic disease conditions, and asthma and COPD were the two diseases we pursued. And so we have apps that came out or in the App Store today where this can enable asthma patients, in particular for this app, better manage their chronic disease condition. And again, in that context, we're carrying out clinical studies to assess the utility of patients being able to collect information on themselves. We have Bluetooth-enabled inhalers, right? So every time you're taking a puff on the inhaler, that's tracked. The location of where you're doing it's tracked. We're getting data feeds in that say what's the pollution levels at the area they're puffing, what are the pollen count levels, what's the temperature, and so on. We also have Bluetooth-enabled spirometry devices, so if somebody looks like they're sliding into an exacerbated state in asthma, they can be fired a text to say, hey, blow into your spirometer when you get a chance, and based on those results, the physician could give them a call, or a nurse practitioner to sort of facilitate their care. So that's sort of on the chronic disease side, but Jeff also indicated what we're doing on the wellness side. So we think, that again, the hospitals like Mount Sinai have traditionally been interested only in the really sick individuals, because they're the ones who come in and you do stuff on them and you make money and you can sustain this operation of helping the most sick. But as you push out into more of this health maintenance organization, taking on the care of patients and managing their care, and you're being paid to keep them more well, the wellness is going to become a really major theme. And so the Resilience Project is one such study. Like Jeff said, the idea is most of disease research, so look at any of the genetic studies carried out, big genome-wide association studies. What's the intent? The intent is to find variants in the DNA that correlate, variations correlate with disease. So you're trying to identify what are the causes of disease. What we started thinking about, that's a somewhat of a failed strategy in the big pharma arena, in that the hope was if we identify those causal guys, we're going to be able to develop drugs against those causal genes and cure everybody of disease. And that hasn't happened, right? And that hasn't happened for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons is it's far harder to make a small molecule to correct something that's broken than to find something that's working that can work around the broken protein. So what we decided was to do one of the first ever large-scale screens for individuals who harbor highly penetrant, highly deleterious mutations that should have caused them catastrophic illness before they turned age 18. But they're 40 years old and they're walking around with no disease whatsoever, so their body found out some way to buffer against that hard genetic hit. And however the body figured out a way to buffer against that is going to be the therapeutic angle that we want to take. So the aim is to screen not just up to 1 million people, but well over 1 million people, to just search for what we call these unexpected heroes, which are people who may hold the keys to treat entire disease communities if we can just figure out, decode how they buffer disease. So as an example, think of cystic fibrosis. If you carry the delta F508 mutation in the cystic fibrosis gene, the medical literature says you will get cystic fibrosis. But we've identified individuals who carry those mutations who do not have cystic fibrosis, right? So how did they evade that disease? So along those lines, we did a retrospective study first, and we looked at 600,000 existing genomes. So this is a study coming that'll be among the largest genetic studies ever carried out. So we used all existing data. We went to 23andMe, we went to BGI, we went to the Broad, we went to all the investigators who were generating big sequence data. We aggregated all of that information and screened them using this bioinformatic pipeline, screened them for all of these highly penetrant deleterious mutations spanning 127 diseases to find those who were special. And as a result of that screen, so here's a Circos plot that's giving you all of the information. 600,000 genomes worth of information is condensed into the Circos plot. The different disease areas that are represented are on the outside of the circle. The red is a histogram that's showing us across those 600,000 genomes how many of the genome regions are covering the mutations we're wanting to detect. Here are the specific mutations that we're trying to detect. And ultimately, from this process, we identified 15 individuals across, I think it was 11 disease or 8 different diseases that were these unexpected heroes, right? There were people who carried the cystic fibrosis mutation or the Pfeiffer syndrome mutation or the Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome mutation, but they did not have these diseases. So we're in the process of decoding these individuals to understand how did they buffer against disease, how did they avoid getting that disease, and then that becomes a therapeutic potential for that disease community and beyond. So based on that, we now have a whole process in place that's a prospective study that anybody can join. At this point, still for free. We're still, figuring out how we're going to do millions of people. Even running an assay that's sub $50, it's still, not a trivial amount of money. But we have apps that can, again, do the electronic consenting, inform you what's happening. You send a kit to your home to provide a DNA sample that goes into the sequencer, and then back come results to you on whether you harbor one of these mutations that should have caused disease in you but didn't. And again, one of the crowning achievements of this is the electronic consenting platform. And what we're doing is a study that shows if you're electronically consented, are you at least as well informed as the traditional consenting process would provide. So the person the clinical coordinator who sits with you, goes through the paper and tells you about the study, are you more or less informed when you do electronic consenting? And our early data is already pointing to the electronic consenting making you more informed. And the reason you're more informed is not only are you going through a series of educational, more advanced electronic educational media, but we get to give you little pop-up quizzes. So, to help assess whether you're really grasping the information or not. And this is something that never happens or rarely happens when a person is consenting you. You tend to trust the person and what they're in your, yeah, I'm going to just sign it. So that's something that's going on, and we have the whole authentication worked out. And so we're doing these kinds of studies. We're going to be collecting lots of information, and the question is, what do we do with that data? How do we build models that can actually predict disease, define disease, come up with new therapeutic treatments, and so on? So I sort of view it like this little animation where you have all these different pieces of data being collected on the person, and of course, as more and more data builds, if you're not organizing that information, it's just going to be this big hurricane of information flowing around that's not doing you any good. But in's going to come the magical pyramid that's going to organize all that information, and if it can compute on it, and if it can be, we're going to use it, and we're going to do all sorts of predictions on yourself. And we of course can do it in a patients like me kind of way. We can look at how you fit with other people, your condition, how you responded, how you didn't respond to a given treatment. And again, based on that more informed context, we can go back and in the context of your environment start refining these different scores as time goes on. As you either get older or you start picking up bad habits or whatever, we can reassess the scores. So we want to get to this sort of, how do we do that? What's the game we play to be able to model in this way? And to get to that can require, again, kind of thinking outside the box and getting away from the sort of the expert view and seeing if we can do things that are non-traditional, things that aren't part of the dogma but disrupt the dogma. And one way to show that, our need to approach data in certain ways, or how you approach data can really determine how you solve the problem. There was this study that I quite liked where 2 groups were given a problem to solve, the exact same problem to solve, which was take the candle, affix it to the wall, and light the candle without wax dripping on the table or the wall. So that was the problem to solve, and the 2 groups were given the identical instructions, presented with the data in exactly the same way, with the exception of in group 2, the tacks were outside of the box versus inside of the box. Other than that, they were identical. But amazingly, just given that subtle difference in how information was presented, group 2 came up with a solution to that problem twice as fast on average as group 1. So just based on subtle differences in how you perceive information can have pretty dramatic impacts on your ability to solve a problem in the most efficient way. And so again, my thinking has always been around the more expert we become, right, the deeper the grooves in our brains become, the less likely we are to innovate and create, the less likely we are to think outside the box because we've been trained in a certain way and we tend to adopt that. And nothing has played that out more than look at the competition-driven problem solving like Kaggle or the dream competitions. And what we're seeing over and over again in those competitions is the non-experts are winning those competitions. When the non-experts go up against, for the breast cancer challenge Dream ran, published in Science Translational Medicine for breast cancer prognosis, it took 3 weeks for a non-cancer, non-biology person to hands down beat all the NCI-funded centers for cancer research. And so the guy was, he might have been at NYU or Columbia, so like an electrical engineer, knew nothing about cancer, nothing about biology, but had algorithms that were, amenable to that kind of problem and won the competition. So again, it's, really important to not let the expertise blind you. Of course, this isn't specific to biology either. We've seen this type of disruption needed across many types of industries, and one of my favorite is BMW. I'm kind of a speed freak, and so I drive a S1000RR and also an M5, and I'll tell you a little story about my other speed on snowboarding. So I was out with my kids, so I'm telling you I'm a little banged up. So snowboarding out with my kids and race down the hill, who can get down first. Here's the kids, and here comes Eric, and all of a sudden, bang! Yeah. All right. So that's overly dramatic. That didn't really happen, but something like that happened. And I'm standing here today. I have a broken clavicle. I broke 4 ribs. I collapsed a lung, and I got a concussion. I'm 5 weeks out of that. So if I don't shake your hand or pulled my shoulder back, you'll know why. So addicted to speed. BMW sat engineers with customers to understand better what they wanted out of the performance of BMW. Do you want better acceleration, better cornering, better braking, and so on? And they were shocked to find that the #1 response back from the customers when they rode around with them was nothing to do with performance. It was, how do I prevent damage from occurring to my car and backing into and out of a parking space? And that's something that the engineers never would have come up on their own, right? Because they're blinded by, hey, we make these high-performance cars. Everybody cares about performance. So they were the first to innovate the park assist features based on this thinking outside the box, going to the customer and learning what they might want as opposed to speculating from their own experience. So the way we play this game, so how are we going to think outside the box in this big data game, aggregating the data, building better models? We're going to do it by objective, basically letting the data speak. Can we take objective, data-driven approaches to organizing information? I like to show it in an animation. So here you're seeing different molecular features, DNA, RNA, protein metabolites, and these aren't connected in simple linearly ordered pathways like the textbooks show in some cases. They're connected in highly nonlinear ways to define biological processes that cause the complex phenotypes we see, and those networks don't act in isolation, right? They act in a concert of networks. And so what we need to be doing is thinking more holistically about how we're going to integrate the digital universe of information to form these models. And once we have some handle on these models, we can start looking at individual components, not a single gene at a time, but a network at a time, and understand how perturbations in one part of the network propagate through, say in a single cell or tissue type, to other parts of the network. And of course, we're more complicated than a single cell or tissue, right? We want to play the more holistic modeling game. So what we're really interested in are how, across the different organ systems and cell types in the body, how do perturbations in one part of the system, again, propagate through to other parts of the system to alter physiological states that we associate with disease. So we're really aiming to get at, this type of circuitry where we can come up with a more holistic model of the entire system and then do biology and discovery on that model. And if you think that this day is not coming for biology, I'll just give you one quick example of Jonathan Carr in my group, who had a paper in Cell a year or so ago. It was the first fully computational model on a living system ever published. And it was a primitive system, so it wasn't a human being. It was a small bacteria with around 600 genes. But he modeled every aspect of that system, from the replication of DNA to the transcription into RNA to the translation into proteins to the metabolic flux through the system in a given under given growth conditions. It had models for each of those processes and then was able to integrate those models into a whole to give a set of starting conditions and then watch the cell live, but living in silico. And so he had the models. And so what you're seeing up here on the graphs on the upper left are the different lines indicate different cells being simulated through his modeling, and time is going, and you're looking at growth along the y-axis. So he's looking at how all these different processes affect the growing and division of the cell, which you're seeing up on the right. Again, this is all computational. And what you're seeing are all the different components, the metabolism, the translation, the replication, all of these different processes being modeled in real time in the simulation and integrated together. And in the end, came up with completely novel insights by then querying the model, knocking out and overexpressing all genes or all combinations of genes, came up with completely novel insights to growth processes in these bacteria that were then experimentally validated. But again, that was all driven in silico. There was no biology that he did other than building the model, and that's where this is all going to go, right? It's maybe primitive today, but we're on that path, and this is where we're going to be 10, 20 years from now. This is how decisions are going to be made on your health in the clinic. And just to show you where we're going, to kind of finish this up in a few more slides, where we're at with this in human biology and our understanding of disease. And I'm being pretty light on the mathematics, and I always, I grew up in a more of a pure math arena, so I always cringe when I now say we're doing mathematics, because I know what the pure math people think of the math we're doing today. But it is nevertheless pretty sophisticated mathematics. It is operating at pretty big scales. It does require supercomputing and all of that. And I'm not going into those details, but if you're interested, I can point you to the 250 papers we published over the last 10 years on how we play that game. But here's how I view it for how we approach disease. Yesterday, it was all about single genes, single proteins, single phenotypes, and how were we going to use this reductionist method to link molecular biology to disease, molecular medicine, failed strategy in general. Today, we have the technologies to take more holistic looks, right? We can look at whole genomes, we can look at whole transcriptomes, proteomes, phenomes. So tomorrow, the biology of tomorrow and the medicine of tomorrow is going to be all around how do we aggregate, integrate those data, make causal inferences, make these network models, and able to predict what's happening in the system so that we can pinpoint in a very precise, you think of the precision medicine sort of mantra you're hearing spoken about from Obama on down. This is the way we're going to achieve precision medicine, is through this accurate modeling of all this information to make the predictions. So for the diseases we tackle, what we're doing is we're taking lots of different tissues from individuals in addition to their clinical data, and we're doing deep multi-omics profiling on those individuals. So think thousands of individuals, all the relevant tissues for diseases from different parts of brain to liver to intestine to fat to lung and so on. And then we integrate the information. So think of all the features, all the variables of information that we have in this space. We use genetic variation as a perturbation source to make causal inference. We apply some mathematics, and we can do that systematically over the space of variables to form these predictive probability network models. So again, I'm not going into any depth about the mathematics behind that, but there's lots of mathematics behind it. I can go into that after the talk. But in the end, we come up with these predictive models, and then how do we use these models then to make new discoveries and to impact human health? So as an example, I'll show you how we went from inflammatory bowel disease, disease that many here I know are concerned about, and there was a big genetic study done in 2012, published in Nature, where they identified 163 loci. I think the new paper coming is well over 200, but 163 loci that they identify for IBD, and they came to me largely to understand what do we do with this information. So we have 163 loci. don't know what all the genes are, don't know what the genes do, don't know what pathways they go into, and don't know for therapeutics whether we knock the gene down or overexpress it to treat the disease. So what we do is we take that information and we project it onto the kinds of models I just showed you to let the models tell us, organize that information for us and tell us how those perturbations are affecting the system. So I project that information over a bunch of different networks to identify which networks are helping me organize and inform what those perturbations are doing. So this was one of the top networks we identified. The pink and yellow nodes represent different DNA variations that cause IBD, different gene expression traits that we monitored in different tissues in the populations we assess, or clinical variables. And the blue and red edges are the probabilistic causal links that we fit using Bayesian network methods, but again, we're using DNA variation as a perturbation source to break this, Markov symmetry, Markov equivalent symmetry to make the causal inference. So we have this model, and if the model wasn't informative for the disease, what you would see is more of a uniform scattering of the projection across the network, but that's not what you see. You see the projection concentrating in a very specific part of the network, highly non-random, so genes in that part of the network are highly enriched for harboring variants that cause IBD in the human population. So now what do we do with that? Well, we can take that network and now query all the nodes in that network to understand how does the perturbation affect the state of the network. So we do that in silico by knocking the gene down or overexpressing it and then assessing the predicted response. So in some cases, we hit the gene, a couple of genes change, but in some cases we hit a gene and the entire state of the network changes, right? We've altered, from a key regulator standpoint, the regulatory state of the network, and those are kind of interesting nodes to focus on because they're changing the state of the network either away from or towards disease. And so we systematically carry that out across all genes, and we come up with this type of model. So this is just another view of the network where we now have different types of nodes in the network. The square nodes are going to be those causal regulators that change the entire regulatory state of the network. The different diamond nodes are genes that harbor variants that cause disease and so on. So this network is 5-fold enriched for genes that harbor variants that cause IBD, but it's 20-fold enriched for causal regulators that harbor variants that cause disease. So we saw a 4-fold enrichment for the DNA variants and the causal regulators playing a more important role for whether they cause disease or not. And so those are ones we care more about from the therapeutic or biomarker standpoint. So how do we get at the therapeutics? How do we actually translating this computational modeling into actually a treatment that can help somebody? So what we do is take the network I was just showing you, that's now in the blue nodes, and the green nodes represent known drugs or natural products, things you eat, that are known or predicted to interact with the coding products of that network. So that's what the edges between the green nodes and the blue nodes represent. The pink nodes represent different disease-associated traits that are known or predicted to change in response to perturbations in different genes in that network. And what you should see from this immediately is this isn't a simple single gene treatment that's going to fix that network, right? There are many natural products and drugs that interact with that network and that are going to change its state. So this whole idea that we're going to give people single drugs and it's going to magically fix them is just may work in some cases, but is not going to work in general. And so we need to understand the constellation of things that are needed to twist this network into a more favorable state to impact diseases in a more favorable way. And not just one disease, because you change one disease parameter and you may affect 20 other diseases in a negative way, and you don't want to, make somebody less diabetic and make them heavier in cardiovascular disease, right? You don't want to, that's not what you want to do, yet that's what we do today. So based on this sort of modeling, we can come up with a treatment by basically pattern matching the effect drugs and natural products have on the molecular state of the system by basically querying those drugs across vast numbers of cell types and tissue types, use molecular readouts as the output, and then pattern match, is the drug changing the network in ways that would be favorable or unfavorable. So we did that for IBD. This was work pushed by Joel Dudley in my institute. And So we did this objective screen for IBD against these networks across all marketed drugs that did not have an indication for IBD, and the top hit at the top of his list was topiramate. So topiramate is an anti-seizure drug that no doctor on the planet was thinking was going to be potentially relevant for IBD, but our data showed, his data showed that if you look at the molecular readout when you give that drug, it very well matches the IBD network. So then they threw that drug into a rat model of IBD, and so in the upper, my shoulders, I can't lift my arm as high, so this is a chemically induced IBD model in rat. So it's caused inflammation, IBD-like phenotype in the rat. And here's that rat treated with topiramate and a standard of care drug, prednisolone, and the topiramate-treated guys looked as good or better than the standard of care. So again, that was completely data-driven, completely out of the box, no a priori assumptions on whether it should work or not, just letting the data speak, using appropriate computational techniques to make those matches, and now this drug's in a clinical human testing to see if it will actually work. So just the final slide is on the ultimate vision for this, is again one of how do we build these sort of predictive models and then start mapping individuals based on the perturbations they have in your life, your genetics, your environmental context. How do we assess how those perturbations are affecting molecular states in you? And based on that information, stratify you into different risk groups or disease subtypes. Here are the different molecular elements that may be dysfunctional in you, and then doing the pattern matching to understand how do you twist that network back to do better things. And it could be a small drug, a small molecule compound that does it. It could be a behavioral modification, diet, exercise, whatever it is, you're on this trajectory and we want to push you off that trajectory, and here are the different treatments that you could take to do that. So that's I think, in my opinion, the future of medicine, how we're going to be treated, how we're going to be assessed. It's not going to be somebody putting a blood pressure cuff on you when you go in the hospital and doing a blood draw. It's going to be longitudinal information collected on you over time, deep sequencing, and high-end analytics to make the calls. At least that's our push now at Mount Sinai. So obviously lots of people involved in the work I was showing. A crew at Mount Sinai, obviously heavily engaged. A number of the neighboring institutions helping with different aspects of this work, and of course maintaining, I co-founded Sage Bionetworks with Stephen Friend and maintain active involvement with that effort. And one of the things I'm most excited about talking in the beginning is our digital health efforts. And with that, thank you for your attention.
We're going to give this award. Black.
You should be here.
Here?
We're going to give you your plaque.
Okay.
That's what we are all here for.
Give you your award.
You'll be in the center.
It's my great pleasure and honor to give our wonderful lecturer the 2015 Institute for Mathematics and Advanced Supercomputing, IMAS, at NYU Polytechnic School of Engineering, the award to Dr. Schadt for uniting various strands of modern genetic and genomic analysis using mathematical and supercomputer models of the multi-scale network structure of living matter and creating an engine for decision-making in modern medical practice.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Gregory. David.
Why don't you say?
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ready? Ready? Give you the hot seat.
All right.
Put you second from right here.
This one?
Yeah. Ladies, you want to sit next to the Are we all connected correctly on our microphones? I sat on mine, so I'm not sure I'm connected. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. Hydration.
Good.
Well, as exciting as the lecture is this second part of our program. Previous to this, I've collected questions from the audience, people who have sent them in by email. And I would like to introduce our speakers, our panelists rather. I specifically recruited them because of their relevance to your lecture. So, in effect, I got some spoilers here.
Okay.
First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ellen Sherrill. Raise your hand, doctor. Okay. She's a graduate of Barnard College, obtained her medical degree from New York Medical College. She's currently director of the Roberts Center for Inflammatory Bowel Disease. Affectionately we call that IBD, so we don't have to say all three words. And you will recall that he brought up that discussion, and I'm going to come back to that shortly. And she's the Jill Roberts Professor of Clinical Medicine at the Sanford Weill College of Cornell University and New York Presbyterian Hospital. She's a world-renowned expert in IBD and has served as a principal investigator for many clinical trials involving Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, where she has proposed innovative investigational therapies. At the Roberts Center, she employs an interdisciplinary approach to healthcare by integrating nutrition with screening for osteoporosis, nephrology, dysplasia, and colon cancer, and by employing new techniques such as narrowband imaging. She is the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters from many medical journals. Sitting to her left, we have Professor Beth Simone Novak, graduate of Harvard University, Yale Law School, Fulbright Scholar, and she received her PhD from the University of Innsbruck. And she is our own Jerry Holton professor, and she has also worked at or been with us at the Robert F. Wagner School, and she is an expert on technology and institutional innovation, and has taught in the areas of intellectual property, constitutional law, as well as courses on electronic democracy and electronic government. And she is joining us from the White House, where she was the first United States Deputy Chief Technology Officer for Open Government and led President Obama's Open Government Initiative. I could go on with her credentials as well, but I think you would like to hear from them directly. The two words that I want to bring up, besides iconoclast and big data, is IBD and informed consent. Now, I'm going to turn to Dr. Sherrill first and say what you've heard about prophylactic intervention and topiramate. I would suspect that you have done a lot of work with topiramate or not. And so why don't you think about what questions you would like to ask?
So, I got the question. Let me ask the question. Let's just define the term inflammatory bowel disease,
Please.
which is inflammation of the bowel that is unregulated, uncontrolled inflammation. We all recognize inflammation if you take a vaccine or you bruise yourself. We don't want anybody to show, but we all know what inflammation looks like. And it is basically red, raised, warm, it hurts, it's tender. You can think of inflammatory bowel disease as in some ways as an inflammation or a sunburn on the inside, okay? So that's what inflammation is. We all know inflammation and we recognize it. It turns on and it turns off. In inflammatory bowel disease, for reasons that we do not understand, the inflammation turns on and never turns off. So it's what we call dysregulated inflammation. So if we come up to topiramate, so here, through big data analysis and information-driven decision-making medicine, you have found serendipitously, and many great discoveries have actually been found through serendipity, this medication topiramate. So when we talk about definitions and medicine, we want to understand mechanisms of action. So you found this, so one question is going to be, what is the cost to do that huge analysis to come up with a new medicine, and what's the mechanism of action? That would be my first question.
Yeah, so I think one of the beauties of the kinds of modeling that we're doing is there may be some large amount of cost for generating some big data on big cohorts, aggregating the digital universe of information and building the models, so there's big compute infrastructure that's needed. But now these models can be queried for any reason. The topiramate, IBD is one of a million different things we could have asked or made available to others to query the system to ask. So it's more of a resource that like you would enter something in the text box of Google, you'll want to query our models as well by reflecting either a query or data off of that model, and you'll get some response back. So the cost, while it may be for a given model in the millions of dollars, it's something that has longevity and can be used for a wide number of things, and those models can be combined as well. So I think it's when you think about physics and other mature quantitative disciplines, those models evolve and get refined and better and more accurate and tested, and based on tests they're invalidated or validated. That's the kind of system we're trying to move towards in biology. So we see the model as the main currency ultimately for how you capture knowledge and understanding. As to the, what was it, the cost of the trial?
Well, the cost of finding this one drug that may or may not actually be relevant, how much does something like that cost? So in other words, systems biology, what's the cost of running a system like that and looking at network perturbation?
Once you have the model, it's free, right? So to make the query for topiramate, it was literally taking the connectivity map database from the Broad and Cell Encyclopedia data and querying that against all the models. And so that's, maybe somebody, an FTE, a couple of hours of work doing that query, and out comes that prediction. So again, once that's all created, we view it again like a Google query. It's effectively free. You don't have to. You have to do the experiment to the rat model thing, so that costs money, but it's not a crazy amount of money. It's what biologists do every day, and so, or clinicians too. And how I view it is that you're just trying to make the biologist or clinician place a more informed bet, right? You're capture a much broader base of knowledge and understanding without having to remember it all in their head or search it up in PubMed. You're capturing it in a model. And then you had the second part.
So you're suggesting that from a cost-benefit analysis, from an economic modeling, this makes sense? Because it costs nothing.
Yeah, I'm saying that it not only does it make sense, but I'm saying in order for biology and disease research to evolve and go to the next level, that it's absolutely necessary that we find a way to capture knowledge and understanding in a model-based paradigm, just like all the other, whether you're climatology, high-energy physics, quantitative finance, what do they all have in common is they capture knowledge and understanding through models. When the physicists, and you guys who are physicists can correct me if I'm wrong, but when the Hadron Collider generates the petabytes of data that it generates, the physicists aren't de novo reconstructing all the laws of physics, right? They have models existing that they're using to predict what that experiment should show, and it's either validated or not, and they refine the models and so on. And that's where I think we need to go with disease. We can't, it's not enough for an individual lab to capture all the information anymore. It's too vast, and unless we start doing this kind of modeling, we're not gonna elevate this to the to the level of a physics where they have these beautiful models that are highly predictive and so on.
So if we go go back to the Sherlock Holmesian model and hypothesis generating. So now you've identified this drug, topiramate, and the question is, what's the hypothesis behind why it works? And is it, okay, so now it's the mechanism of action, and are you going to actually invest funds in taking it from the rat model to a cellular model and then introducing it to a patient? And then what's the larger cost-benefit analysis?
Yeah, so here I'll say something that may be controversial or upsetting too.
Okay, controversial.
And I'll say, the whole, mechanism thing is, like, it sort of gets to one of my sayings is there's no such thing as pathways, there are only networks. That these things you think are simple linearly ordered pathways, if you affect this protein, it causes this to change and this to change. That's just an illusion. That's a motif that may happen in the complexity of the space in which it occurs, but those elements in a linear pathway are connected up to thousands of other molecular features in a very complicated and nonlinear network. And so from a mechanism standpoint, I don't view what we're trying to do in the traditional biochemistry sense of the mechanism being able to physically understand what it is, that you have these two entities, they physically interact to affect some phenotype. That's the traditional model. I'm working more from emergent states of networks, that the context of the network, the shape of the network and how it's connected defines through very complicated behavior higher order processes, and we can't necessarily understand what that is, but we can understand the effect a given drug or perturbation has on the network. We can monitor. It's like the drug discovery of old, where you're doing high throughput screening against phenotypes, but now the phenotype is much more sophisticated. It's a molecular state of a network that defines all the processes that are going on, and if we can understand the state, how that state's changing, we can make the match to the physiological parameters. So I would say it's not necessary. I get it, I like to understand things too, and the mechanism can be important, but it's not necessary to understand the mechanism to get to an effective treatment.
So just to come back to the individual patient, because you're talking about perturbations in large networks
Yes.
that then become pattern recognition and significant. So the small scientist who's sitting in his or her lab, painstakingly looking at cells and
Right.
cells, has a role, but we're just not sure how it fits into the big data model.
Well, so I can comment on that because that's a really important point. So yeah, so I obviously have this bias of the network view and big data, but I view that as highly complementary and synergistic with the wet lab, deep thinking, encyclopedic knowledge biologist who's doing the deep dives at the bench, and that what we can provide, how it's synergistic is we can provide a context within which to interpret the types of things the individual will see at the lab. And looking at a handful of genes or making a single gene perturbation, we can provide a richer context in which to interpret that, in which to prioritize what's the single gene or combination of genes you're going to go after. So I don't view it as a replacement, I view it as a guide that we're working synergistically to make the model better and better, and the model's going to get better and better because it's going to generate a hypothesis and the biologist is going to go and test it.
So let me interrupt. So I'm trying to connect the dot between Ellen and you. She's in the trenches. She's in the hospital. You're in the computer lab. She's trying to figure out a problem. You're doing whatever you do. And so the question becomes, how can she access you, and how do you help her in her day-to-day existence today, not a couple years from now?
Yeah, so we've done...
Ellen, is that a good question?
That's a great question.
Okay.
And so
If you want to add on to that, well, pile on.
well, Eric, while you're formulating a response, because it's really an overarching and very significant and large question, it speaks to the human-IT relationship that for the most part technologies have missed. Right, so you alluded to that in sort of looking at sort of the consumer, right? What do they want? But that's what this is really all about, the IT-human relationship and how technologies miss it. So how...
Yeah, it's a really critical point that we think a lot about, and while we don't have it worked out for many common human diseases like IBD, we have made pretty significant inroads in cancer. So cancer a little simpler from the standpoint of having bigger data, harder perturbations, clinically more actionable things can be done around those. So what we do today is just like we do for IBD, we can look at a given cancer patient, we can sequence them and understand the perturbations occurring in that person in the context of the models we build for the different types of cancer. And based on what we learn from that, we generate, here are the key drivers in that individual that are disrupted and causing that. Here are the types of treatments, just like the topiramate thing, here are the treatments we map to, and then we generate an actual report that we then sit with physicians in a tumor board type meeting where we have an informatics scientist and a genetic counselor and a genomics person and a medical oncologist, and we discuss what it is we found, how we found it, and what the medical actionability is of the predictions we're making. And then based on how confident or not we are in those, the medical oncologist can make a decision on whether they give a non-standard of care treatment or combination to the individual. So we have this personalized cancer therapy study going on, and that's like one way, one avenue. And we see that as we mature. The problem with like IBD is it is an incredibly complicated disease, and I don't know that we have the best handle on it yet. We don't have all the data we want to have integrated to build the best models, and this is some of the early stuff, and we hope as it matures that we can have the same kind of impact we're having in cancer.
I'm going to come back, but I want Beth to feel unloved. So Beth, I want to put you on the spot, to put him on the spot, and I picked up two words: informed consent. Now, I understand there's lots of consents, and you made a very good presentation about how I can give you my consent. But how informed is my consent? What do I really know that I'm saying that I'm permitting you to do? And as an introduction to privacy and information, I will now turn it over to you to ask a really intelligent question.
I'm writing down, I have 100 questions that I could ask if we had as much time. So no, on exactly this point, I think the eye-opening part of this presentation and of this kind of work is this notion of essentially crowdsourced science and crowdsourced genomics. The fact that the president gets up in his State of the Union and subsequently announces this precision medicine initiative, and it's not just about $200 and some million in grants, it's about creating a 1 million-person research cohort, the idea of working with large-scale samples. It changes everything about the equation. Everything that you do changes every aspect of the traditional orthodoxy, as you pointed out. The idea that it's heavily bottom-up, that it's user-contributed data, that we have to change the mechanisms by which we get that kind of consent, and presumably done right, the way your friends at Sage BioNetworks want to do it, it's openly available research samples that can be reused not just by your lab but by 100 other labs, and then by entrepreneurs who want to use that to build apps on top of it. So it's basically, we're creating the Apple App Store model of scientific research and of patient treatment. The question, the question I want to start with to you is, given the number of sort of paradigm shifts, or the number of sort of transformations in the traditional process, turning all of these assumptions on their head, large-scale samples, bottom-up, user-driven consent, multiple reuse, open sharing of a kind of data commons. The question is, what needs to therefore change about how we organize institutions, about how we organize research, about how we fund it, about issues of hardware and security and storage, obviously. I mean, I happen to think, and Jeff's question is getting at the issue of, are we doing privacy, are we doing the consent piece right? I happen to think that what you're showing is beginning to nail the consent question, but all the issues of storage, security, transmission, governance of data when it's being, I'm consenting to give it to I don't know who at the other end. Anyway, we could talk about this for a long time, but given that you've been thinking a lot not only about how to do the science, but how to organize the institutions and pick the institutional framework in which to do this kind of science that's hospitable to this kind of science, I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit on how we, and this is directly to the user consent question, how we organize the practice of science institutionally, legally, structurally. What are the changes that need to get made? What are the environments, what is it that makes the environment hospitable to doing this and to doing it in ways that are ethical for end users?
Right, so on one level.
That's one question.
One
That was
level,
one-
it's
that
a
was
pretty
one question.
overwhelming set of questions that, I would never claim that we figured out. Like, we're, I think, learning, like everybody else, how this game is going to be played and how we're going to transform. And
I'll settle for what doesn't
but
work.
I'll say a couple of things just to respond, and we can have a discussion. First, being on the consent side, I think, first of all, people, how many people here use Google, Gmail, or Yahoo, and how many of you read the consents about what you're consenting to?
I just-
the digital
I agree,
quick view?
I
You
just
just say you
next.
agree, and, right, and so you gave Google consent to read any of your emails and to use that information for whatever reason they want, and why the hell would you do that, right? And the reason I think you do that is because Google is providing you a valuable service that impacts your life in a favorable way. You're able to seamlessly send emails with very large attachments, it's very robust and reliable, and so on and so forth. And so given that it's useful to your life, you're sort of trading, not really thinking about, or maybe you do think about the fact that you're being targeted with better ads, like you don't have to search the internet as much because they know already what you're thinking. So I think there's that sort of, I think while there are lots of privacy concerns and how the data is going to be used and so on, a key driver for me is we need to make it useful. If you make something that's useful, that's predictive, that's actionable, that can cause people to have a better life or make better decisions and so on, that they're going to far more tolerate the kinds of risks that are going to come up around privacy and misuse of the data. Not that we shouldn't care about it, but just I think if it's a driver, we'll see a much better uptake. So that's one response I'll have to that. The other thing we're doing that I think is somewhat transformational, so you mentioned the openness of the data, that with John Wilbanks and Sage, that these consents and so on, they're doing it that it has to be all open, out in the open. But the way I think about it is more you're empowering the person. So it's no longer a government agency or an investigator or a medical school that's making the decision for you about whether you should receive data generated on you, which I just can't, being an outsider to the medical community and the paternalistic nature of clinicians, so frustrating to me to say the physician wants to be the gatekeeper and you shouldn't be allowed to see information. When I started the genomics sequence your own genome course at Mount Sinai, several deans of other medical schools came to my dean to try to dissuade him from allowing that to happen, claiming that students were going to hang themselves, that we'd walk into the class and there would be the student hanging from the rafters. No lie, like shocking to me to think that it was so ingrained that somehow the medical system needs to be the gatekeeper and it's your information and you should be entitled to do whatever you want with that information, and you may not fully understand it, but why not put the user in control? If you want to contribute data generated on you to a different researcher than me to better understand your condition or to maybe have a bigger impact on science, like why shouldn't you be allowed to do that? So most of what we're doing gives users direct control over the data, direct access to contribute that data in whatever way they see fit, and in contributing it can be done in an open way where it's openly shared and people, there's some governance rules around being responsible with the data use and so on, and that's being fleshed out how that can be enforced. But I'll stop maybe with those 2 points.
Well, let me just, if I can just push on that one, then ask one more, which is coming back to the institutional and other sort of trappings around it. Are there impediments in the way of doing this kind of commons-based, crowdsourced, open science? Maybe you've gotten rid of those roadblocks for yourself and therefore you're not sort of aware of them. I mean, you know that what the orthodoxy is and the way funding is given and the way IP is handled and the way institutions organize themselves in silos not to act in collaborative networks. So I'm just wondering if there are one or two either policy changes or institutional changes that you think have been key to enabling you to do this kind of work.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, there are very significant IRB issues. I don't mean to dismiss that there's no risk and we should just be in the Wild West and do whatever we want. I think there are real issues that IRBs take very seriously, but they're so overly paternalistic that they are an obstacle. You know, getting electronic consenting approved, getting return of genetic information approved, especially stuff that isn't maybe quite known if it's medically actionable or not. All of these things have you know, that the IRBs are very, very protective about, and so how to get, you know, them to loosen that sort of information as people become more educated and the information becomes more freely available. And my sort of point to the IRBs have been, at some point you're going to be unable to control this information. You're going to be able to walk into Walgreens, device off the shelf, and sequence yourself on your own computer. That's not, you know, that device exists today. It's not in Walgreens yet, but in a few years it will be in Walgreens. And so what are you going to do? You're going to be unable to control that kind of information. And so how do we not be so tightened with the rules that we prevent ourselves from being able to learn how we I think we have a lot to learn is what I'm saying, and we need to run the right kinds of studies and do the right kinds of research and do the right kinds of evaluations about what people do or don't understand, about what works and what doesn't. Like, we need that empirical research done, and we can't do it if we can't get the right studies approved.
So your last point there, if I can just follow up, I think gets to the question I wanted to ask you, which is, I think the fear of people hanging themselves from the rafters is real in the sense that you know, you can do the research which says you have a 30% chance of X or a 40% chance of Y.
Of dying next year, maybe.
I saw that little 30% chance of dying thing go by, that caught my eye. And the question I have is, you know, the solution to how patients, you know, the advice that you give patients about how to react or respond to that information, that's going to be, so the two questions is, how do you get clinicians to catch up, both in terms of how they're trained and how they practice, and how do we get the social sciences to catch up? Because it seems to me that hanging from the rafters is a social science problem more than anything else. Because the question of what are people's incentives, what are the behavioral mechanics, how are they, you know, there's been some work done on this concept of nudging or choice architecture. If I show you this instead of that, you're more likely to exercise or to eat right. If I put the salad in front of the dessert on the buffet. But we have so little understanding. I mean, behavioral economics is a you know, is the sort of nascent field in which that's done. But I think on the social sciences, we're not catching up to the kind of work that you're doing. So do you have social scientists in your group?
Yeah, so it's a really...
Are you going to have some, and how are you going to handle the, you know, because the translating this into outcomes is going to depend as much upon that and the psychologists and the economists and the lawyers as it is, I think, upon the, you know, big data folk.
Yeah, it's a great point. In some of the early apps we've developed, we've not done in isolation. We've done in collaboration with groups like Apple and guys from Twitter and Google. And these are guys who run groups, who have social scientists in the groups. And they do, like I was, because we're not masters of that software engineering and user interfaces and user experience. And how do we get people to engage in something and respond to it and growth hack? But the IT industry, Google's, Amazon's, Facebook's, they know how to play this game, right? I work with a guy, Elad Gil, who growth hacked Twitter from 1 million users to 200 million users. So they know how to appeal to those users and what they want and how they respond to information. And when they started designing these apps with us, they had the social, they did focus groups and user groups, and they videotaped those individuals, and they were videotaping off the device the facial recognition patterns for how they were responding to the app, where they were looking, what they were pushing, and then the social scientists working with them to discover patterns of what's, like, it was just really surprising to me the depths that they're going to understand that. And I think we need more of that in the, you know, closer to the life and biomedical sciences in this arena. And so we've chosen to do that in an early stage by partnering with these companies that know how to do that well. On the medical side, how do we get physicians and others to engage in this type of information and model? I'm really on the negative side on this. My personal take is we need new medical schools. Like, we need to go knock at the door of you know, Google and Apple and say, hey, take your $150 billion, Apple, and let's start a medical school that completely just turns upside down the type of people we attract in, how they're trained to engage information and understand probabilistic reasoning and so on and so forth. So, like, I think it needs to be that disruptive. I think if you look at the existing infrastructure, it's just the orthodoxies are just too ingrained.
Well, I think that's a great statement. And before I turn it over to you, I'd like to ask a question, because he seems so very sure of himself. Right? Let me just ask my question, and then you can turn it over to you.
That's from raising money.
What, if anything,
it's pretend.
What, if anything,
We're children.
keeps you up at night besides your children and your dog? I mean, what do you worry about in what you're doing in your life's mission right now, or your business, or however you want to describe it? What keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing, it's less related to what I do and more just the general technology evolution and how we engage technology and how we allow it to enter our lives and make decisions. It really, it gets to is the AI the next existential threat to the human race? And it's sort of what I lay awake thinking about at night is that if we as a human species don't become more purposeful for the kind of world we want, I think we're going to get a world that none of us wants. And and it gets to the engagement of that technology. Do we want robots performing every aspect of what humans typically do? Like we're not being very purposeful in that. We're just letting the technology fly by, and as scientists, we just don't think about a lot of the social and ethical and long-term implications. And so how do we instill the need to be more purposeful, and if that's not possible, what is
ethical, whatever that means? Yes. Ellen.
So just to come back to the physician-patient relationship, this has been honed over many, many years, and I think this helps to answer your question from pre-Hippocrates to post-Hippocrates. Right. And of course, Hippocrates was the father of the controlled trial where observation was critical, forming hypotheses based on observation and clinical outcomes, right? So there's I want to reassure you that if you actually do go to sleep, because my sense is that you probably don't sleep very much, that this is a species, our species, that's going to evolve slowly, and technology is going to be part of that evolution, okay? The point is that the physician-patient relationship is critical to understanding and optimizing IT, okay? And so we haven't heard a lot about that. We know that medical schools can be more creative and need to be more focused on healing, but healing does come from the Greek word to make whole, and you're looking at whole networks, we're looking at whole individuals, and so we always say that the magic of patient care is caring for the patient. So these network systems should allow us to care more for the patient. You're talking about inflammatory bowel disease. We're talking about individual patients with inflammatory bowel disease. How does big data really impact on an individual patient? So that's one question. And how does science and big data interact so that we can further both, okay? And then the second question in terms of governance is we're trying to protect research patients, right? Patients who enroll in research studies, they may not be aware of who would have their data. And so this is where the whole common rule and governance of big data comes in. And those are some of the things that just signing an informed consent miss. So I think we still have to touch on all of that.
Yeah, and again, I think on the IT side, it's exactly right. I think it is one of the holy grails, and that's where the Apple Medical School comes from, is I think how, it can't be Epic. Epic is not the system that you as a physician want to be using to learn more about a patient, because it doesn't contain, you don't know anything about what that patient was doing 6 months before, typically maybe before they came into your office, what sort of events they had going on, what, their blood sugar or inflammation levels were, how they were fluctuating over that time, how long they had to wait or for an appointment, all these different parameters you have no idea about when that patient walks in. So how to collect all that information. So the apps are one way, it's in the hands of the user, they can contribute that information, but we need the right IT infrastructure that's not Epic, but it's Apple helping us build that kind of Apple, maybe it's initially around Epic, but it's making far more data available around individual patients in the context of many patients, so that you as a physician can say, all the features of this patient that I have, how does it match to all the other patients I have, and what sort of group does this patient fall in, and how did that group respond to this treatment I gave, gave, or that treatment I gave. Like, you have access to none of that, but if that information can be collected, aggregated, and the appropriate interfaces, and this again is something Apple's very good at, where the interfaces you need are not the query system and the terminal through Epic, you need it on a smart device where maybe there is no typing, it's all you're just speaking what you want, natural language processing queries like talking to Watson, and you're getting the feedback in from the patient. So I think that's, when I talk about the medical school of the future, I think it's around that sort of evolution where we need to be making, right, the digital universe of information available to the physician in a natural language sort of way, natural interface way, where you're placing the context of the patient, the data you have around the patient, in that digital universe. And
Okay,
that's
before
how
you ask your follow-on question, here's what we're going to do, because some people have to move on, and some of us want to stay here because it's very rich and provocative. You'll ask a question. If you want to ask one more question, then we're going to adjourn. Those people who would like to stay and come and meet our panel and our guest speaker, please queue up. But I will ask you the last question.
Okay.
Chairman's prerogative. Please, your follow-on question.
Well, then you have the governance. How do you organize all this information?
Because these are such huge topics, but I think that the question is, how can the American Gastroenterologic Association, the AGA, help to get us to the point that you're talking about? So we all know that EPIC is that's my question, okay? So AGA is a huge national organization that does look at patterns and recognition and actual capturing of longitudinal data that can link to biorepositories. They are as frustrated as you are in terms of the EPIC, the point and click. Yeah. We all know, and John Allen is the president of the AGA, the Chudnovskys were here when the AGA came to Weill Cornell Medical Center, New York Presbyterian Hospital, as a symposium to how can we make this better. But that's the real question. How can the AGA be involved? We do actually do a lot of pattern recognition and capture of data in EPIC, but it's not queryable in the way that we'd like it to be for big data.
Exactly, and I think it needs to be facilitating partnerships, whether it's advocacy groups to help fund the type of work and collaboration, say with an Apple, that can generate the right sort of management organization of that data in ways that are queryable and ways that are useful to the physician, but then the right types of interfaces as well. This isn't, the apps we're building are a first instance of that, geared, what I showed was more towards the consumer, but we have apps as well that are for physicians and to help facilitate interaction between physician and patient. So I think it's all about just finding a way to engage those right sorts of resources to just start making these things. And for IBD, we have this guy, Sheesh something, blanking on his last name, he's a clinician who has started pioneering some of these smart apps. So there's like a path there that's already being done to
Right, and I should let you know, of course, that at Cornell also they're pioneering individual apps. So I think everybody is sort of getting toward that point.
But I think the way to sort of accelerate it again is we need way more. It's not enough to say 1 out of every 100 people we have is going to be this informatics person making an app. It's going to be almost the reverse. Like in China, BGI, you look at how many bioinformaticians they have for each sequencing machine. It's like 50. Right? In the US, I think we have 1 or 2. And that's the evolution we have to go through, that this is way more of an information-driven game, and it's not the one smart guy making an app. It's Apple, right? What it took for us to build that asthma app was working with Apple engineers and Y Media Labs and another software company, LifeMap Solutions. It was a team of 20 to 30 people working really hard over a 6-month period of time to get to that. So it's more of a, that scale is needed to sort of get it to the point where it's kind of like at a Google level where you can query it. So it's just a bigger commitment and engagement of those that system.
Did he satisfy your question? He might have given you a response, maybe not the answer you were looking for. Question.
Well, we will define that going forward.
Okay. Beth?
Our question, there are no answers. This is an ongoing conversation, which is what's so exciting about this, I think. So to that end, let me ask you another open-ended, impossible to answer question, which is, to do this kind of work, we have to create incentives for people to share their data. One part of that is obviously the consent piece of it. and overcoming, the problem before, which was I would sign away permission and my data, would go to, I didn't have any control over it. I signed away control over my samples, my tissues, and my data, and then it went only down one narrow pipe, and I didn't know much where it went to. Now I can send it out to a lot of places to do a lot of good of the kind that you're talking about. But I'm wondering, beyond the sort of consent app, what if you had sort of 3 wishes or 3 things we could do to create those incentives in the physician's office, at the supermarket, wherever it may be? Maybe it's 3 kinds of data that you wish were openly available and shared, 3 sorts of things we could do, incentives to get people to share their data, 3 stories we could tell. I'll leave it up to you, but how are we going to arrive at that big data future?
Yeah, I think on the incentive side, especially in the physician arena, where I understand there are real laws that prevent you from paying patients to contribute, but I think we need to be really, somewhat out of the box. So we are running these studies in East Harlem and, in these really underserved populations, and people are wondering, how does this benefit me and why should I care? And so I think changing the way we're able to incent, I think being able to pay, almost like you're contributing something just like you would do on YouTube. You contribute your video, and if it gets enough views, you're going to get paid some amount of money for that. So I think being able to compensate directly in a financial way, I think could incent as money, as this data gets aggregated, and it will be used in Target and CVS to shoot you with ads, and what are you going to prefer, what won't you prefer? Like, people are going to make money off of that, and what we've seen through Gmail and others is people are willing to contribute the data, again, if they're getting something useful back.
And is CVS going to open up that data then and contribute it?
Perfect. And so I think that's sort of more on the incentive side of how we might enable people. So I think it's going to be either directly incenting them through some kind of big reward like money, or you're providing something so meaningful back that they're going to want to contribute it because they're going to get a more informed view, and they're going to live a healthier life, they're going to live longer, they're going to suffer less, whatever it is. I think that's going to make a big difference. How, the data that could be made available, I think that is, I think first of all the medical center data should be released and available in a very public way that researchers can engage. Apple has taken a pretty aggressive stance with all the data collected off the apps, wanting to centrally house them through Sage or other organizations to be publicly available for all to operate on. So I think, again, it's seeing the technology companies become actively engaged in collecting the information on individuals, but doing it in a way that facilitates open sharing of that information. I'm pretty pessimistic on whether companies like CVS or Walgreens or others are going to make the types of data, credit card purchase histories, all this stuff that can be pretty informative for what's going on in your life and how to better interpret your molecular data. It's unclear to me how we're going to incent those who make a lot of money off of that information to simply release it so that others could compete with their businesses. So it's unclear to me how to.
Well, it's interesting. We do have a Wikipedia now, so there are people who like to open network, and I think that's a great place to stop this conversation. But one of the reasons that Tondra and I have been doing this for 16 years is we like to have the audience have some takeaways. And we bring people with very outstanding careers up, and we let these people dream about how they can become you, or what have you learned. Okay, so give us 3 bullet points, so my colleagues and the students, where you are in your career. Can you give them 1, 2, or 3 bullet points that they should take away, besides banana vomit?
Yeah.
Today.
So I think one of the big things in my career that led me to where I am today, and sort of the path that I've had sort of an interesting path in starting companies that have been bought and made some money, being chief scientific officer of companies, technology companies, and now in academia. And it was letting yourself bounce around a bit. Like, don't become so locked in to a given path that you sort of feel like
prepared to be Bill Gates, you're saying?
prepare to be Bill Gates, and just to let yourself bounce around. Like, don't get locked into things too soon. Be really open, interact with really smart people. That's to me, the key to success in this arena is the better the people you can interact with, the better you're gonna be, and the better your work will be. So I think that's one big takeaway. I think one of my mantras has also been blurring the line between academic and industry research. We sort of live in this world where it's left versus right, and it's like, I don't know why we've evolved to be this, this sport team versus that sport team, and but we have sort of this industry versus academia, and that one is good and all-knowing, and the other is evil and just wants to make money. So you have to just get away from that and know that you can blur this line and you can leverage benefits that exist in both arenas, maximize the positives and minimize the negatives of each by letting them counter each other. So I think not being afraid to engage, there are lots of smart people in industry. Nobel Prizes are won there, and again, it's all about connecting with the people. So I think that's another
Good.
takeaway.
So what I'd like the audience to do is join me in a round of applause for our panel. I think this is a perfect example of this number 2 rule, which is surround yourself with smart people. And we've got some smart people, and they're going to be here on the stage before they go out and have a drink, and you're all welcome to have a drink, answer some of your questions. Don't monopolize them, because everybody wants to speak with them. And same time next year. Thank you very much.
I get bombarded at cocktail parties.
Thank you.